Yeah, so you've all been introduced. Geoff Lewis from Founders Fund. Founders Fund is invested in, amongst others, BitPay. We have Jan Hammer, from a partner at Index Ventures, who has invested in BitPay and Sapo most recently. Barend, managing partner and founder of Hummingbird, which recently invested in Kraken, a Bitcoin exchange based in the US. And Steve Waterhouse, a partner at Pantera Capital, an investment firm focused exclusively on Bitcoin, has invested in Sapo as well as Ripple Labs. So it's interesting to be here because I did chair the similar panel last year with VC investors, and I think it shows how far Bitcoin has come since then, because I think only one of the panelists of the VC investors had actually invested in Bitcoin. So it was a very interesting conversation. It was all about why they hadn't. So I think from my perspective, it seems like Bitcoin has grown up a lot in the past year, and we've seen a kind of an increasing separation between established Bitcoin players and kind of the rest, which in a way shows the power of institutional investors to create kind of standouts in the Bitcoin space. You know, whether or not that's going to change in the next year will be interesting. We can talk a little bit about that. But maybe we could just start by asking you guys from where you sit, how has it changed from the VC perspective? Is Bitcoin no longer a sort of contrarian play? Is it now a trendy thing that people are doing in Silicon Valley, wanting to get invested in? Maybe Geoff, you could start with that.
Sure. Well, I think from a U.S. perspective, myself and many VCs in the Valley have never been more bullish on Bitcoin. And there's sort of the few different reasons why. I mean, there are the sort of ones that were mentioned in the last talk. Also things such as the SEC has authorized Bitcoin for the 2016 election. So once politicians start receiving donations in Bitcoin, sort of realize the benefits of not having to pay bank fees. I think that's going to play out in all of these different positive ways. There's the fact that top talent is just leaving Google and Facebook, and they're very real, very proven entrepreneurs starting Bitcoin companies. And so one of the key questions actually is, what is the sort of contrarian edge now for investing in Bitcoin? All good investments are contrarian investments. So, you know, folks like Roger were very contrarian when they started buying up Bitcoin. I think there is a question now of why should one be even more bullish than everyone else. So I think that the consensus in Silicon Valley among VCs is people are pretty bullish. So you need to have a contrarian bullish narrative on why are you even more bullish than everyone else if you want to keep investing at this stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to build on that. I think a year ago we had, as you pointed out, not that many companies well funded, and we've gone a huge long way in those 12 months. And the progress has happened, in my view, in three areas on the infrastructure level. And it'd be merchant services, it'd be exchanges, and it'd be sort of banking and storage services. So in all those three areas, we've seen some great companies funded and really creating a layer of infrastructure upon which more businesses can be built. So kind of looking forward, there's already a foundation of these kind of three components on the merchant side, on the consumer side, and sort of exchanges in the middle, kind of inviting more entrepreneurs to build more cool stuff.
I mean, some of the investments we've seen so far have been in, let's call it the safe end of the Bitcoin universe, the sort of exchanges, the wallets. Do you think that's going to change in the next year? And is that, you know, should VC investors be looking even further ahead as to, you know, the kind of things that Bitcoin can enable and investing in those sorts of ventures?
Yeah, certainly I think that the last year or so, the last few years, have seen investments in infrastructure, you know, building out the Bitcoin ecosystem. But I do think we'll start seeing investments, and we're already seeing companies approaching us that are building applications that you could only build with Bitcoin. I think the next, you know, we've got a couple, you know, for the next 10 million people who come into Bitcoin, we're going to need something which is mobile and social, integrating Bitcoin together. I think you know, Apple's recent move to put Bitcoin apps back into the App Store will help. But you know, currently we don't really see a very strong social network-enabled Bitcoin application. We're starting to see some companies coming out with that. And Bitcoin just needs to be easier to use for average consumer, I think, to really crank through the next 10 million people.
So what are you seeing coming into your inbox in terms of pitches? Is it changing? And what would you like to see in the next 6 months to a year that you haven't seen yet?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we've done quite a few investments, let's say, outside of Bitcoin into emerging markets, and I see some of the best use cases out there. Think remittance. Just as an example, every year about $3 billion gets remitted from a place like Dubai to Sri Lanka, and then Western Union takes 15%, but on top of that, there's some thug at the exit with a stick taking another 15%. So that's something where you look at a broken system, and this is where we would like to see more and more entrepreneurs focus on. But we've seen some of them still very, very early days though. So
totally agree that remittances is like obviously Bitcoin presents a huge opportunity there. There is, I think, a fundamental question around, will the existing players, people like TransferWise, et cetera, will they capture the value there around Bitcoin, or is there actually a wedge, an opportunity for new companies to form there? We're seeing a lot now of services for developers, so things like, which we're not invested in, but think is an awesome company, Chain.com, is here. So I think things like that, companies offering services for developers are going to be increasingly common. And then there's just all this stuff outside of Bitcoin that the blockchain enables. And we're just only scratching the surface on what having a truly distributed ledger enables. And I think that's really going to be the primary theme over the next year in terms of where the companies get started. If it truly is like 1994, 1995, then one could argue, Yahoo was founded in 94. I think Netscape was founded in 94 as well. So it's possible that the really big existing first wave companies have actually already been founded and funded and have been on the slides that were just shared. And so I think that's possibly where we're at right now.
Yeah. So is it getting more competitive to get the good deals? Are you now, if you've got an established or a coherent business plan from a Bitcoin startup, are they now getting multiple offers from VC? Has it become more competitive to get the good deal?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely sort of greater awareness following the deals that have happened. But I would still kind of separate what we're seeing and the category that we would like to see. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of catch up on merchant services. There's still sort of infrastructure developer tool type companies. But actually, back to the use cases like remittances, I think we need more emphasis from entrepreneurs on smart, easy to use, great user interface consumer applications. And I think, back to the kind of the chicken and egg, you're equipping at the same time the merchants on one side, consumers on the other side, and kind of at Index, we'd argue that the merchant side has advanced ahead of the consumer adoption. So we would actually love to invite entrepreneurs to come up with more creative, simple ideas to get adoption going on the consumer side.
Maybe to your point of competitiveness, there's more and more investors looking at it, but still I feel in a way we as an industry, we got a bit spoiled the last 5 years, I guess. A lot of people build a great track record, but in an environment where cost of building a company came down tremendously, we got our head around a lot of the business models. You could throw a photo app out there, a really shitty product, and kind of start iterating and people would forgive you. Those are all the things which you cannot do in this space. So I think suddenly you see a bunch of us, including myself, you have to really come outside of a kind of a comfort zone. Lots of moving parts, we're getting our head around lots of the acronyms. And so at this point, yeah, it's a bit fashionable, but I see most of the VC community, at least in Europe, at this point more in listening mode and not exactly going out there taking big bets, no?
Yeah, I think
more in listening mode, you said.
More listening mode, yeah.
Well, okay. I think that the sort of single power law factor that has made it a lot more competitive from an investment standpoint over the last 6 months has been somewhat controversial, but the sort of Andreessen tweet storms around Bitcoin. So there is a sense in when one of the most leading public VCs in the world is just constantly talking about something, it does drive this sort of insane competitive dynamic, and I think that's contributed to a lot of VCs getting really interested in Bitcoin in this somewhat perverse way.
Yeah, I think well, one unusual thing I've actually noticed is that there really are VCs who are obsessed with it, and then others who are just saying, no, we just don't think it's going to happen. And I've still seen that a year later. So it's a very polarized perspective in terms of whether people get it or they don't.
They love it or they hate it.
They love it or they're like, I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to some people last night who said that they'd spent an awful lot of time pitching to VC investors that just were like, tell me about Bitcoin, and they had to waste an awful lot of time.
Yeah, there's always a lot of education happening. You shouldn't take those meetings.
Yeah.
I think it's probably never been a better time to start a company in Bitcoin in terms of getting something going and getting it funded. The question is, are you going to build something that's going to last? Are you going to build something that's a big enough idea to scale?
Right. So what is the goal of VCs in investing in Bitcoin? I mean, because some have a sort of proselytizing role, and they want. Is it to encourage wider Bitcoin adoption, or to strengthen the exchanges? And does promoting Bitcoin sometimes go against the interest of your investors? I mean, how do you kind of square that up between, well, we know that the exchanges need to be strengthened, the infrastructure needs to be strengthened, but our investors may get a better return out of maybe something else? What do you think about that?
I mean, our firm is focused 100% on Bitcoin. We have a hedge fund arm and then a venture fund arm, and so we get about 20 people spend all their time thinking about Bitcoin, working on Bitcoin, promoting Bitcoin, figuring out which deals we should be doing. So we're definitely have a very symbiotic relationship between promoting Bitcoin itself and finding good venture deals and investing in them.
Oh, that's an interesting point, because you are investing in Bitcoin itself. Are any of you actually have a fund investing in Bitcoin itself?
Well, we don't directly invest in Bitcoin out of the fund. I think all of us on the partnership are personally invested in Bitcoin. So obviously one frame for making investments in Bitcoin companies is it's quite hard for a sort of traditional venture capital firm to just accumulate coin directly. So one could look at some of these companies as a proxy for investing in Bitcoin directly. But the primary frame for us, I think, is we do believe this could be one of the most important technological advances in the world, and our mandate is to invest in the most important companies in the world. So there's sort of two pieces to it.
I think the way I was pitching it a year back, talking to some LPs who got a bit worried when we started talking about investing, is that in the end it's about backing great entrepreneurs, building great products. And I think for all of us being active in the industry, at some point you have a level of pattern recognition, understanding a bit better or with a higher chance who are truly extraordinary people. And somehow you find them in this room, and you don't find them in other areas anymore. So that's why we started to pay attention. And I think, so it's quite simple. It's nothing more complicated than that, I guess, no?
Yeah, same on our side. I guess our investors are free to go and buy Bitcoin if they want to, for diversification reasons. But ultimately what we're looking for are great franchises that can potentially be billion-dollar companies.
So the biggest issue remains wider adoption, I think, and we've seen big names like Expedia come out recently saying they're going to accept Bitcoin, but there's still no major retailer that has come out and said they're going to use it. Are you expecting that to change in the next year? What's your sense on that?
I mean, happy to take this also slightly from a BitPay perspective. I would argue that there already are retailers.
But we haven't had an Amazon or a really major retailer say that they're
Newegg announced adoption of Bitcoin. Zynga did. WordPress. There are names that are being added to the list as we go. So the progress is obviously incremental. But every name added to merchants that accept Bitcoin kind of validates the opportunity for this payment method. So I'd say, time works in favor of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think a year ago there was nobody really accepting it, right? I mean, very few merchants, and we actually think we're come an incredibly long way in a year. So.
But
sort of my sense on it is it's like how sort of merchants and companies were trying to figure out what to do with social circa like 2006, 2007. So it's something that it's on everyone's mind as a question that they're thinking about. When I talk to people at large sort of commerce companies, it is something they're like actively trying to figure out the strategy. They're not really doing that much yet, but they're trying to figure it out. And then there are companies like BitPay and others that have the infrastructure and are aggressively working to partner with these merchants. So I do think this will be like a watershed year on that score. And frankly, I think it has to be a watershed year on that score in order for things to keep moving forward. We need to have widespread merchant acceptance. So.
And so what are you expecting in terms of investing in the coming year? I think we mentioned this when we spoke earlier about the transition from early stage funding to maybe growth funding. In other words, not funding a brand new startup, but maybe doing a second round for some of the Bitcoin companies that are already out there and need to expand and grow. Are you expecting to see more of that in the next year?
I think we're certainly thinking that we're going to be investing across the spectrum of stages. So we'll still be doing seed stages and then through to follow-on stages. But I guess we still think there's a lot of opportunity in the early stage companies right now.
Barend, what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, we're Series A focused, so I'm not really, don't have a good view on the later stage. It seems to get a bit more crowded recently, and people have a bit more traction to work with. And this is the hard part about the early stages. So many moving parts. It's a bit hard to see, and I don't see too many investors willing to take the bet. But that's okay. I think what we now see with crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, is that a good chunk of that might be handled by a community of people out there. So.
I mean, some of the companies are really working, so there's going to be a lot of growth stage investment in them. To the extent things really work and scale, there are going to be growth rounds. So I think that's going to be happening.
And what about the whole regulatory climate? How is that impacting your investors? Are they worried? Are they feeling a little bit more comfortable now that the U.S. has clarified a few points? We have regulatory climate has moved on quite a bit in the U.S., whereas in Europe, you've got the European Banking Authority sounding the alarm. So there's a little bit more uncertainty there than there was before. I mean, how is that impacting your investment decisions, both sort of geographically and the kind of things that you're investing in?
Oh, we're bullish long term, but imagine having to go through looking at all of the portfolio of the last 10 years and then adding $1 or $2 million in an early stage just to spend on lawyers, legal, compliance. I think a lot of the innovation we would have seen and some of the results we just would not have today. So that's something that keeps me worried, certainly, looking at any company out there. But again, I think 12 months from now, 24 months from now, we're in a very different shape, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, at our side, I think we're pretty encouraged. I would say on the macro level, if you analyze what the EBA report actually said, it clearly identified risks for existing regulated financial institutions, but equally, it encouraged the existing financial, fiat currency operated banking system to bank and interface with companies in the virtual currency world. So I think the report needs to be sort of read in a balanced way, because there was this encouragement to one system interface the other. And then on a micro level, what we're seeing with the leading companies in the space, and certainly the ones we have invested in, is that they actually hold themselves accountable and hold the highest standard of procedures as regards risk, governance, KYC, AML, and all the other buzzwords that you should comply with, to the extent as if they were regulated under legislation applicable to regulated financial institutions. So on this kind of micro level, so long as the participants uphold the highest standard, I think the whole system will, in the long term, benefit, and the two systems may converge to the same sort of level of regulatory standard.
In the US, I think the implicit stuff is often far more meaningful than the explicit regulatory stuff. So for example, the tax treatment around Bitcoin was clarified in the US. I think everyone was like, wow, this is a massive regulatory legitimizing thing. I actually don't think it was, because there are lines in tax returns for declaring illegal income for things like drugs and selling arms. People typically don't declare their income, but the SEC the IRS is happy to take taxes on that if you choose to declare it. So I don't think that was a huge sort of watershed moment. Whereas I think the U.S. Marshall auction was as mentioned, a massive, that's just like a massive positive signal. You don't auction off arms, you don't auction off drugs. And so I think, we've seen now the framework in California where the governor this past month, made it clear that there is nothing illegal about dealing with Bitcoin in California. There's the fact that you can now, in 2016, contribute to candidates in Bitcoin. There's sort of all of these things that have happened that, frankly, never would have expected 12 months. Like it is actually mind-blowing, the progress that's been made. We believe we were somewhat late getting into Bitcoin at Founders Fund, primarily because we thought there would just be all of this insane regulatory pushback that just make it impossible. And so we've been really, really surprised pleasantly on how fast things have moved.
It seems like as well that there's certain jurisdictions that are more welcoming to Bitcoin, and that's going to help a lot as well. Like Luxembourg, I think, has come out and been quite welcoming to Bitcoin. The Netherlands. Are you seeing emerging areas where the authorities are more accommodating, more welcoming? The regulatory climate is clearer, and that's going to help generate more Bitcoin startups that can operate with ease?
I actually think there's a pretty big opportunity in Europe right now. If a company can get licensed in one of the countries in Europe and then passport that license around the European Union, I think that we may see the emergence of big, maybe consumer level and retail level Bitcoin companies in Europe before the US and before the rest of the world. So I think we're definitely looking at Europe as opportunities in investing right now for that reason.
Right, okay.
Still, in terms of visibility, think of a startup where you have limited resources with your people going out and suddenly everybody wants to hear you. So regulators, yes, they're paying attention in Luxembourg. Actually, they tried to organize a little Bitcoin conference this very day, I think, out there. But it's very hard for a startup to understand, okay, you got all these people flying to Japan and everywhere, and then everybody wants to listen to your story. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to really do something with that. And then judging that, qualifying that as a startup, it's something where you could easily be evangelizing for the next 2 years and not getting anywhere. So it's still a bit of a challenge, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Isn't there still a problem with Bitcoin startups having a hard time getting bank accounts? Like, just, in the US in particular, it's a big problem. What can VC investors do to help expedite that process?
Yeah, in my view, VCs can help with governance and installing a sort of a level of risk management governance, know your customer procedures, such that the Bitcoin businesses become good partners to their banking partners. And I think Mickey Malka said this at the previous CoinSummit in San Francisco, that he's far more concerned and stressed the importance of the relationships with the banking system rather than with the regulators, and I do agree with that. And again, banks have been modifying their views. We've seen that real time, and I think banks need the comfort that the Bitcoin company partners they are going to do business with are good partners, and that they have good governance, clear procedures, and to the extent that those are adhered to, I think good business can develop. So on a practical level, we're seeing a lot of these banking dialogues and relationships opening in a positive way.
But it's still pretty early days. I mean, traditional banks have been just, slammed with all sorts of new regulations, capital requirements, fines for all sorts of illicit behavior during the height of the crisis. And the last thing they want to do is touch anything that's going to give them another compliance, another kind of regulatory headache down the road. And I think that's why you haven't seen, major banks take on Bitcoin companies. They just don't want to touch it. It's kind of considered too much of a headache. How is that going to change? I mean, Silicon Bank, I think, is the bank for Coinbase, and that's been a stable relationship.
There are certain banks that are embracing it. This is definitely like one of the big limiting factors. It's a risk factor. I think things are going to evolve and get a lot better, but there are banks like SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, that companies can work with. It hasn't been a barrier to scale for any of the companies that we've been involved with so far, but definitely a very real issue.
Yeah, it's something we've definitely spent a lot of time on at Pantera, is helping our companies get better banking relationships, new banking relationships, and and globally, not just US-wide.
Right. I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor if anyone's got anything. If not, I can continue.
I'm from SWAR, but we have a sort of decentralized I'm Joel, the CEO of Swarm. As you can see in the back, we have a decentralized crowdfunding platform. And I think we've seen a broad shift towards entrepreneurs going out and engaging with other entrepreneurs or just other people who have Bitcoins that understand the technology very well and doing funding very rapidly. And in fact, to do our own platform, we fundraised on our own platform and raised, whatever, $1 million USD in 2 weeks or something like that. And I remember last year I was actually here meeting with someone from Index, and I had a meeting, in the Index office and said, and I had prepared a lot and everything, and then I sat down and the partner said, "What is Bitcoin? Why is it important?" And it was just sort of like, I was like, oh my goodness, I spent all this time preparing, like why do I need to spend all this time explaining to VCs like what Bitcoin is and how does it work? And so I guess my question for you guys is, we see this broad shift in this direction towards entrepreneurs and people who have Bitcoin just directly engaging with each other. And I'm curious what you see the sort of value add of traditional VC vis-a-vis these kind of new decentralized crowdfunding platforms.
I think that's a really good question. So I think our view at Founders Fund is actually that VCs tend to overstate their value add, and that entrepreneurs should generally assume that the primary value a VC is going to offer is writing the check. Now, this is not the consensus view. I'm sure every other VC on this panel will disagree with that, but at the end of the day, the most important thing a VC can do is write the check. And you are right that there are now these alternative methods to raise funding. Crowdfunding seems like you guys have done a really good job of that at Swarm. I do think, though, that as these companies scale, there's a need for growth capital. I think that on the margins there are things that having top tier VCs even in your early rounds, even if you could go on Indiegogo or Kickstarter or Swarm and raise a round, there are sort of credentialing things that can help with hiring, and some VCs are well positioned to help with sort of macro advice in particular industries. But yeah, I think generally the value add thing is overstated with VCs. I think that's a fair point. And I do think the financing landscape is changing, and there are all these new ways to raise funding. And if you can raise non-dilutive funding and you believe that you have a good strategy, don't need any help from VCs, I'm all for entrepreneurs doing that. So congrats on being able to do that successfully.
I think it's a fair point, but and while we support the idea of a math-based currency, I'm not sure if I'm there yet to understand the idea of a math-based type of company. The point being that it's still going to be about building a company. We spend about 1/3 of our time assisting our entrepreneurs with interviewing people and going through all the horrible things that you go through in a startup, making it happen, and a bunch of people getting them to work together and all of that. So we're a piece of the puzzle, nothing more, nothing less, I guess.
Well, do you think Bitcoin is more ripe for crowdfunding than some other types of, tech investing?
I mean, I think the Oculus Rift outside of Bitcoin was probably the most dramatic example of a crowdfunding company that then went on to be acquired. I think that was, if people hadn't woken up to the possibilities of crowdfunding by then they did. I don't see anything specific about Bitcoin. I mean, we're still building companies. It's a lot of the same things. You've got to hire people, you've got to build products, you've got to get it to market, all the kind of basic things. In my last company, I was lucky enough to be backed by initially Kleiner Perkins and then Index, and hiring people when you have those kind of backers is a lot easier. And there is a war for talent, and especially in Bitcoin right now. It's one of the strong reasons why there are so many companies in the tech space, at least, still focused in Silicon Valley. You can get great people when you're all in the same kind of place, and being able to have that credential of, oh yeah, we've got these great backers and we've got runway, all these kind of things really helps you. Maybe not at seed stage, but definitely through Series A and onwards.
Yeah. I don't know, it just would seem to me that if you're a Bitcoin millionaire, say you got in early and you're sitting on a lot of Bitcoin, you probably don't. You're a believer, you don't want to, you drunk the Kool-Aid, you don't want to sell. And that's one of the issues, of hoarding is a big problem. But you could invest your Bitcoin in a Bitcoin startup and sort of, double down, so to speak. Yeah. And so in some ways, it is more ripe for crowdfunding model because there is this whole other universe of people who, want to play even more in the Bitcoin game.
Yes, so the general view I would take is that there's great room for crowdfunding platforms. They're an important part of the ecosystem, and at Index we're actually investors in companies that are platforms like CrowdRise and Patreon. And I would argue that they have specifically a good place at a certain stage of a company's development. But back to what different types of investors can bring, I would actually argue that for Bitcoin specifically, the great use or sort of reason for going with crowdfunding can actually be, getting customers together with the investment. And a lot of companies have done that successfully on Kickstarter in terms of pre-funding a product. So effectively using the platform as a sort of a marketing tool, as a way of getting your message out. And I think that can be great value because you're signing up people who may contribute, but you're also signing up potentially interested customers. So perhaps that can be an example that there could be an individual, an angel, who would join such a round through a platform. But to me, that's more a provision of capital rather than the ability to use a crowdfunding platform to really open it up to potentially millions and actually getting customers, which I think is a pretty interesting way of using the platform.
Anyone else?
Some great names came out of Europe as companies, but...
Can you introduce yourself as well?
I'm Olyqua Minko, and I'm here to get inspired and actually find interesting ideas to sort of jump into. One stat that is quite interesting, some great, almost household and Bitcoin community names come out of Europe, and yet 95% of cash is invested in the US. What drives that? Why is that happening?
Well, I'm from England and I live in San Francisco, so I'm one of the people who left, I guess, but I keep coming back. We're very focused globally, but a lot of the technology that's getting built is happening in Silicon Valley. And I think there are network effects that people have studied this issue and beyond just Bitcoin and tech in general. But I do think that we will see, and there will be great opportunities for investing globally, especially local exchanges, what we call on-ramps, people solving the regulatory marketing issues locally in each jurisdiction. But most of the tech stuff we see is still happening in Silicon Valley right now, and I encourage everybody to focus on ways to change that, because I'd certainly love to spend more time in London and investing in companies here too. So.
Anyone want to?
Oh, I think it's too dangerous for me to answer this question as an American who's currently in Europe. Well, I'm actually Canadian, but no, I mean, I agree. I think there is a network effect in Silicon Valley. There are obviously great companies in Europe, like Bitfury, that have scaled really fast. I think that generally the companies in Europe, it's harder to raise the early stage capital than it is in Silicon Valley. But then once you're starting to scale, I don't feel like that. It seems to me like you're still quite easily able to raise growth capital for the ones that are working. So. Hopefully things will get better. I think it's more of a European early stage investment ecosystem question versus a sort of Bitcoin cryptocurrency specific issue. And obviously there are firms like Hummingbird that are great at focusing on early stage companies here, and hopefully there'll be more over the coming years.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you, Nick Zeeb from LMAX Exchange. So Bitcoin's obviously got the first mover advantage, but my question to you guys is, do you see any investment opportunities in the altcoin/appcoin space at the moment?
Well, I believe in the power law, and I think that Bitcoin is the cryptocurrency. So no, is my answer.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. It's not just a first mover advantage, it's the stats that we were seeing earlier that CoinDesk have been putting together of a number of developers developing to this platform, a number of companies starting in the space. It's a juggernaut, and people keep focusing on it. And I think that betting against Bitcoin's a bit like betting against Ethernet or HTTP, and there were lots of things wrong with those protocols and environments, and people fixed it. And there's still things wrong, but they keep fixing it. And now we stream movies over the internet, and people thought that was crazy in the early 90s.
Yeah, there's a power of the network effect. So you have gravitational force coming to Bitcoin rather than the others.
I wanted to ask you, Bitcoin has had quite a volatile year in terms of price. And that's probably changed investment sentiment when it crossed the $1,000 mark. People got really excited, and as I understand, some people who had a hard time closing deals were able to raise funding from VC investors. That's now, the price has gone down. Where do you think it can go? I'm going to ask this really annoying question, but where do you see the price of Bitcoin going in the next year? I think a lot of people here in the room might want to hear from you on that.
I have to be a little careful answering this question because we also run a hedge fund. What I would say is go take a look at Susan Athay's work correlating the velocity of Bitcoin money, velocity of money in Bitcoin, with transaction volume, where transaction volume excludes speculative transactions. And that's certainly a very strong indicator as the number of transactions in the network rises, as the number of merchants accepting it, the number of people using it, the price has been going up in correlation with that. So yeah, it's been volatile, but there's a strong upward trend. So I'm definitely not going to pick a price.
Okay. Anyone else?
Not right now.
Anyone else want to talk about where they think Bitcoin can go and the volatility of the past year?
Well, we're not in the business of predicting foreign exchange for Bitcoin, but for that matter, for euro to dollar. So I guess I can't give you that direct answer. We're in the business of investing in entrepreneurs and companies. But I guess to your earlier question as to, it's been volatile or it's gone up or it's gone down, I guess it's important to zoom out and actually not look at a weekly chart or a monthly chart, but really, if you look at a 5-year chart, it gives you a certain picture. And I think it's very easy to get carried away with near-term movement, but it's also important to remember that volatility is a function of volume and density, and that volatility should mathematically reduce with greater transaction volumes.
I mean, the time when I'll be really bullish is when there's very little volatility. I do predict that, I'll just go on, since you really want a prediction, I'd say like 2000, Bitcoin 2000 by the end of, sometime within 2014.
Wow, okay, that's good. It's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.